The distance separating the model of creation from the model of the creation is vast. Because certain words such as produce, body, project, artifact are common to the description of both, it may seem that the two are less radically antithetical than they are. But the overlapping vocabulary is itself the sign of how absolute the difference is between them, for they share the same pieces of language only because the one is a deconstruction of the other, a reversal of the path of creation to the creation. That is, torture begins at precisely the point where the other has left off. It starts by appropriating and deconstructing the artifacts that are the products of creation: wall, window, door, room, shelter, medicine, law, friend, country, both as they exist in their material form and as the created contents of consciousness. 175 Torture ends at what is the other's starting point. It produces the pain that has not only been eliminated by the act of creation, but whose very existence had been the condition that originally occasioned the act of creation. In the one, pain is deconstructed and displaced by an artifact. In the other, the artifact is deconstructed to produce pain. Thus torture not only deconstructs the products of the imagination, but deconstructs the act of imagining itself. Each of the two entails a structure of action that occurs along a path common to both, but the two move in opposite directions, and only one can be occurring on that path at any given moment. The idiom common to both announces they both aspire to inhabit a space which can, at any given moment, be inhabited by only one. Thus they are not simply opposites but are mutually exclusive. They are not simply deeply antagonistic to one another. The very existence of each requires the other's elimination. Civilization and its deconstruction, what for lack of an appropriate term will be covered by the awkward word the civilization, exist in these two models as absolutely distinct, an absolute distance separating them because they cannot exist on the same ground. But there is a conceptually, not always chronologically, earlier moment in which the distance separating them is less, a moment in which they are not yet radically distinct but are only in the process of distinguishing themselves. In this earlier moment in creation, the made thing, the artifact, is not yet, as in the chair, given a material form, and thus is not yet self-substantiating. A chair is an asterisk invented thing yet is also a real thing. Its reality is confirmed in exactly the same way as the reality of a naturally occurring object, such as a tree, is confirmed. Each can be perceptually experienced within the body of the perceiver. Of course, attributes, color, shape, sound, of objects in the physical world, trees, chairs, vary in the degree of reality intuitively accorded them because they vary in the number of bodily senses through which they are experienced. Those attributes confirmed by both vision and touch tend to be felt to have a greater reality than those attributes experienced by only one of the two, or by one of the other senses without these two. So, for example, Locke's famous distinction between primary and secondary qualities may turn on the sensory modes through which the quality is perceived. Primary qualities, shape, mass, are attributes accessible to both vision and touch. Secondary qualities are accessible to only one of the two. Color can be seen but not touched, or by neither of the two. Sounds and smells are heard and smelled but neither seen nor touched. But in the process of creation, there is a stage at which the invented thing has no material presence in the world, is thus accessible to none of the senses, and is therefore judged to have no reality, to be unreal, or to be not yet real. To have a material form is to have a self-substantiating form. To lack a material form is to lack the autonomous power of self-substantiation. The creation of the chair can be broken down into two phases of making. First, imagining the chair, inventing the idea or image of the chair. Second, making the chair, inventing the material form of the chair. In both phases the object is invented, but only in the second is it also real, self-substantiating. Both will be called created object, but the near synonym for created, fictitious, tends PNLY to be applied to the first, for the second is real. The city in the poet's mind is a fiction, the city on the island of Manhattan is a fact. And though both fiction and fact are from the words meaning to make, fingery/victim facery/factum, the difference between them in everyday use recognizes that in the second, a further stage of invention material realization has taken place. Thus, as will be elaborated in a later chapter, the full process of making in civilization entails the two conceptually distinct steps of making up and making real. The imagination only considers her work complete when her own activity is no longer recognizable in the object she has produced. In the distinction between the model of civilization and the civilization looked at above, the benign model was one in which creation had not only made but made real the artifact. But at an earlier moment of creation, the making real phase has not yet occurred. It is here, where creation has only arrived at the making up phase, that the distinction between the models of creation and the creation are more confused. They are not yet wholly separate but are in the midst of separating themselves. That is, the reality of inventions in this first phase poses a problem, whether what is invented is the image of a chair, the idea of a god, a prophetic intuition about the future appearance of a city. The imagined image, or believed in belief, may itself be capable of taking a future self-substantiating form, as in the chair, or it may be fundamentally incapable of ever taking that form. But in either event, at the moment when the made thing is only an idea or image or belief, with no verbal or material extension, insofar as it has any reality at all, it will only have reality in the mind of the embodied imaginer who is at that moment in the act of imagining or believing it. It will have no reality for anyone outside the boundaries of the believer's body. It is crucial to notice here that even for the imaginer it has less reality than do the contents of his or her perception. The image of the chair, however wonderful, will be less palpable and full than the tree now leaned against, seen, and touched, for its trunk bears one's weight, the leaves brush one's face and make sounds as they move. Those who have attempted to describe the experience difference between an image and a perception, Hume, Jaspers, Sartre have all agreed that the perception has a vivacity, from vivere, to live the sensorially alive experience of seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, thus one's own aliveness is experienced and seems to certify the object's reality, its vivacity 176, that the image simply does not have. The image, to use Sartre's description, is by comparison depthless, two-dimensional, impoverished, dry, thin 177. The distinction they observe may be observed by anyone by closing one's eyes, imagining for a few minutes in as much detail as possible another place, then opening them again and looking at the room in which one sits. Even if the place imagined is more intimately known than the actual room itself, the actual room will have an immediately recognizable reality. That the imagined place simply does not have a vibrancy of color, form, presence. That is so overwhelming that there will not be a moment's confusion about which locale one at that moment actually inhabits. 178 Only when there is no competing perceptual content, as in sleep and dreams, will the imagined object have the vividness of the real world, and that vividness will quickly dissolve when the dreamer wakes and is at once confronted with much more vivid mental content. 179 Thus, even for the imaginer, the image is less real than its order inceptions, and for anyone outside the imaginer it has no reality at all. When, as here, the invented object, the fiction, has itself no autonomous source of substantiation. Its substantiation may be provided by analogy. For example, the non-self-substantiating idea of a god, whose asserted reality is itself experienciable, may by analogy be confirmed by the beauty of the trees that can be experienced perceptually. A god's presence is felt in the perceptually feelable reality of trees, river, wind, mountains. It is not, however, just and in natural occurrences such as landscapes, but also the compellingly experienceable sentient presence of pain, or the compellingly experienceable spectacle of visible bodily alteration and injury, that come to be used as a source of analogical substantiation. A dividing line between civilization and decivilization can be drawn between analogical substantiation that requires sensations free of seeing, hearing, touching, and analogical substantiation that requires instead the sensation of But even within the realm of alone, a dividing line can be drawn between human and animal for the displacement of human sacrifice with animal sacrifice, and its implicit designation of the human body as a privileged space that cannot be used in the important process of substantiation, has always been recognized as a special moment in the infancy of civilization. If this is taken as an early line of separation between civilization and its antithesis, it is clear that both torture and war still belong together on the side of the civilization, since each requires human in the analogical verification of its fictions. But now, finally, a third backward step may be taken into the realm of human alone. Even here two separable categories exist, with only one allowing the forward movement up through the successively more benign displacements from human to animal to, finally, no point 180. That is, within this overall negative realm a distinction can be made between the comparatively benign situation in which the human body in confirmation of the belief belongs to the believer himself, as when, for example, a tribe chooses to read its own physical sufferings as sentient verification of the existence of a god, and a profoundly different situation in which the belief does not belong to the person whose body is hurt in its confirmation, as when a non-believer is sacrificed or tortured to demonstrate the authenticity of the fiction, whether the fiction is political, religious, or something else, such as the assertion that the gate is impregnable or that the tribe will next year grow wings and be able to fly. The first relation between body and belief, in which both the body and the belief, or both the pain and the image, belong to the same person, is a primitive structural equivalent for the most benign and familiar form of substantiation that occurs, for example, when an observer confirms the existence of a tree by seeing a tree. Just as here the entire structure of the perception, both the perceptual act, seeing, and the perceptual object, the tree that is the content of the seeing, is present within the body of the observer, so in this early form both the sentient experience of the pain, not now seeing but hurting, and the object, not now the tree but the imagined tree, or to make the distinction clearer, the tree god, occur together in a closed loop of interior mental experience. Further, when the person reads the reality of the pain in his hand as an attribute of the idea of tree god in his imagination, he in effect, as in the later model of creation, deconstructs the pain in the realization of artifice. Depending on how important the tree god is to him, he may even willfully increase the pain in his hand, so that he can again deconstruct it in transferring its attributes to his imagined tree god. Alternatively, he may experience the pain as so distressful that he chooses to heal his hand and eliminate the pain, and accept the diminished vibrancy of the tree god. Because both are occurring within the boundaries of his own body, he himself can compare the disadvantage of suffering the aversiveness of the pain with the advantage of having present to his mind the idea of a tree god, and can modulate their interaction and choose between them. Eventually it may even occur to him that he can have both the vividness of the tree god and the absence of pain. That is, he will move on to discover benign sources of substantiation, such as carving an image of the tree god which is now perceptually available to his senses as a freestanding object in the external world, and thus he need no longer depend on pain to provide vibrancy. But the other model, the wholly deconstructed relation between body and belief, where the substantiating body belongs to one person and the substantiated belief belongs to a second person, contains none of these three modestly redeeming advantages. Sentience and self-extension are now wholly separate and work against each other. For there to be hurt occurring in one person's hand and an image of a tree god in a second person's imagination is not an anticipatory mime of the structure of perception eventually relied on to confirm actualities in the external world. The equivalent here would only exist if there could be one person who had the sentient experience of seeing without any content. If, for example, a flood of light suddenly burst upon his eyes, while simultaneously a second person experienced the object of perception without the act of seeing itself, a vibrant image of the tree suddenly presented itself to his mind, even though he were himself blind. Second, the pain in the victim's body is not deconstructed in the realization of the artifact, since the artifact is not present to him, he disbelieves it. Third, since the hurt and the fictional object reside in different locations, since they are not contained within a single comprehensive consciousness, there is no possibility of judging their relative advantages and disadvantages, modulating their interaction, and choosing between them. Because the believer is separate from the aversiveness of the pain, there is less chance that he will go on, like our first believer above, to invent more benign ways of making his tree god vibrantly real. Thus, the difference between the two models is this: in one the belief belongs to the person whose body is used in its confirmation, in the other, the belief belongs to a person other than the person whose body is used to confirm it. It is perhaps unfortunate that so overwhelming a difference is stateable in a single sentence, for the fragility and brevity of utterance cannot accommodate the magnitude of the difference it attempts to articulate. The sentence starts and stops, is spoken, and then is over. Its significance may be held or lost, may be sustained or may, like the sentence itself, slip from view. Part of the difficulty in holding visible its significance arises from the fact that although the 20th century has engaged in constant acts of invention to a degree never occurring in the world before, and although it has also been preoccupied with identifying the presence of the human hand in constructs that were not always in earlier centuries recognized as human creations, not only is God a fiction, and law a fiction, but childhood is a fiction. 181 Sexuality is a fiction. 181 Even wilderness has been persuasively identified as an invented construct. 183 Very little inquiry into the nature of fictions has actually occurred, and thus creation, which will eventually come to be understood as having moral and ethical import at least as great as what in earlier centuries was ever perceived to be entailed in questions of truth, is at present barely understood in even its most elementary forms. When one day the nature of human creation is fully unfolded, a new language will accommodate a long array of distinctions that are now nearly invisible, and that only begin with the profound difference between the creation and a lie, between a fiction and a fraud. 184 It will be clear that creation is not a unitary event but entails various temporal stages of a realization process, and that new problems arise at each successive stage. It will be clear that the moral and aesthetic value of a Given creation does not just depend on the content of the fiction but on the nature of the substantiation used in its confirmation in the transitional period when it is between the states of having been already made up and not yet made real, and far, far back in the most atavistic form of substantiation that entails the use of the injured human body, it will become strikingly clear that the most fundamental relation between body and belief turns on the question of whether a person uses his own body in confirmation of a symbolic displacement of that body, or instead uses the body of someone outside the benefits of the invented construct in the confirmation process. Though this distinction will be clearer later, it is needed here now, for torture and war, so deeply alike, are at last different in this critical element. If each requires the most atavistic form of the reality-conferring process, in the one it is the non-believer's body and in the other, the believer's body that is enlisted into the crisis of substantiation. The distinction also makes it possible to recognize the size of the moral chasm that separates conventional war and nuclear war. Up to this point, the two have been spoken of as one, and the inclusive term war used, because the structural attributes reciprocal activity of injuring to produce a non-reciprocal outcome abided by all because of the reality-confirming power of injured bodies 185 were equally characteristic of each. But now an overwhelming structural difference must be attended to. In conventional war the beliefs substantiated by injuries belong to those who are injured, while in nuclear war the beliefs do not belong to those whose bodies have been used to substantiate the constructs. That is, the very nature of the weapon eliminates the possibility that those injured can have consented to contribute their bodies to the substantiation process. They do not have the option of deciding whether the disadvantages of physical suffering and the advantages of the beliefs to be confirmed exist in such a ratio that a war should be fought, that the aversiveness of the pain is less than the benefits to be derived from the constructs, or instead should not be fought, that the aversiveness of the pain is greater than the benefits to be derived from the disputed constructs. Because the populations of the disputing countries cannot be consulted when the moment comes to fire the missiles, nuclear war has all the scale of conventional war, rather than the two-person structure of torture, but conforms in all its new massiveness to the model of torture rather than that of conventional war. Revolutions in the technology of weapons have always tended to modulate the degree of participatio to of the combatants. When, for example, in Stendhal's The Charter House of Parma, the young hero, Fabrizio, first wanders onto the Napoleonic battlefield, an old vivandier warns him, "Your grip isn't strong enough yet for the saber fighting that will go on today. If you had a musket I wouldn't say anything, because you could fire your bullet as well as anyone else." 186 The old woman recognizes that one kind of weapon requires years of practice, years devoted to anticipatory participation before the actual participation begins, while the other makes it possible to begin the act of participation. To enter the process of substantiation, beginning on the day when the war itself actually begins. Thus one requires a much longer and deeper level of participation than the other. The significance of this difference is widely recognized outside fiction. In his study of the arms question as it occurred in feudal Japan, Noel Perrin observes the same difference between sword and gun. The nature of the sword made it necessary for the samurai to devote their lives to attaining the skill to use it so that they would have the power to defend their beliefs when the occasion arose. They were thus shocked when the introduction of the gun made it possible for the farmer, himself unskilled in weapons, to kill as easily as the samurai could only after years of practice. 187 As the result of such a technological revolution, fighting is in effect democratized, and the need for a warrior class, in this case the samurai, is eliminated. Similarly, William McNeill shows that in Europe the introduction of the crossbow eliminated the need for a class of knights. 88 Later, the introduction of the gun would further extend the effect of the crossbow, and still later, more and more technically uniform guns would diminish the amount of practice required to shoot them, for the soldier would no longer have to learn the sighting and firing peculiarities of each weapon. 189 In each of these historical moments, more and more of the skill formerly required to use a weapon is built into the new weapon itself, thus increasingly freeing the participant from the amount of his life devoted to that act of participation. It can be argued 190 that with these successive inventions, populations become increasingly liberated from war, rather than devoting an entire lifetime, samurai, knights, to preparation for the actual occasion on which one has to substantiate one's beliefs. A person need only enter those acts when the actual crisis arises. Thus they are free to devote themselves to world building in the period when there is no dispute. But it should be noticed that although more and more of the injuring skill is becoming built into the weapon itself, thereby freeing the human body from the requirements of learning these skills, some level of skill is always needed of the body. The guns do not move onto the field of battle by themselves. Each requires a human body to carry it there, aim it there, and fire it there. This minimal requirement, of course, disappears with the introduction of nuclear missiles. Nuclear arms may at first appear a radical extension of the freedom. Now the population is not only free of the constant preparation of learning how to handle the weapon, but their presence will not even be required in the weapon's firing when the actual war begins. So completely have the formerly embodied skills of weapon use been appropriated into the interior of the weapon itself that no human skill is now required, and because the need for human skills is eliminated, the need for a human presence to fire it is eliminated, and because the human presence is eliminated, the human act of consent is eliminated. The building in of skill thus becomes in its most triumphant form, the building out of consent. It is, of course, only at the firing end of the weapon that human presence is eliminated. Their body's presence at the receiving end is still very much required. That is, injury will still have the same two intended functions as it had in conventional war. It is by one side being out-injured that a winner and a loser will be arrived at. The injuries will collectively memorialize the fact that such a reciprocal activity took place and will, presumably, certify the reality of the verbal issues. All that has changed is the overwhelming first premise of war and the contest structure, that the beliefs belong to a given population, that the bodies used to substantiate the beliefs belong to a given population, and that this most extreme use of sentient tissue can only be sanctioned by those to whom the tissue belongs. 191 Although the vocabulary of asterisk consent has its most recent and thus most familiar elaboration in the concept of democracy, it is much older than democracy. What is deconstructed in torture and in nuclear war is not just the democratic impulse but the basic impulse of civilization, the fundamental integrity of the relation between body and belief present in the infancy of symbolic thought. It may be that the elimination of this first premise from war will carry with it the elimination of the second function of the injuries. Although nuclear war will bring about an unprecedented level of injury, the injuries may not in the end work to produce an abiding outcome, since they will memorialize that a contest took place, but not one willfully entered into. The injuries may be experienced by the populations as something done to them by two governments, and those two governments may be disavowed. What is remembered in the body is well remembered, and that no consent was given in this massive sentient alteration is likely to be part of what is remembered. Thus it is possible that rather than an acceptance of outcome there would instead be an indifference to outcome and a rebellion against the existing governments. Of course, if such a disavowal is to occur, it would be preferable that it occur before the weapons were used. It might be argued that even in conventional war, the agents of the war are the kings and cabinets, rather than the populations, of the disputing countries. Rousseau, for example, is one of many who have argued this, and the existence of compulsory draft has been interpreted as eliminating the act of willed participation. By comparison with nuclear war, however, this assertion is simply untrue, for if there theoretically exists 100 degrees of consent, in nuclear war the level is 0 while in conventional war it may fluctuate between, for example, 88 and 100. Let us say that in World War I an American boy has been drafted into the war and that although unsure of himself, he chooses to go, rather than be jailed or go into hiding. Though a constrained act, some level of consent has occurred. He now goes to his job ch2 announce his departure, gets his papers in order, says goodbye to his friends, and in particular, his sister Margaret. With each of these small acts, his level of consent and participation is growing. He walks to the ship, he picks up a gun, he puts on a uniform, not once, but each morning, day after day, he repeats it on, renewing each time his act of consent. He could have, on the first day, refused to go, or he could now on the 300th day feign injury or appendicitis and so, for a time, exempt himself from further combat. He may stay on the front and fire at the enemy, or stay on the front and fire straight up into the air. His own authoring of his embodied participation did not just occur on the first day but on the 3rd, the 40th, the 500th, and for this reason government leaders, military commanders, and comrades will work to sustain his consent, keep high his morale, over endless days. His fundamental relation between body and belief takes many degrees and radiates out over thousands of small acts. Perhaps the issue for which he risks his body is not the same as the government's issue. He may contribute his body to substantiate an idea of courage he has, or an understanding of ambition, or a world safe for democracy, but he will have some belief for which he performs the work he performs, daily recertifying its importance. He may have been misled, and may be fighting for injustice rather than justice, but at least his government had to present him with its case against the opponent rather than considering its military actions independent of its own population as jury. That a jury can be misinformed is one thing and not the same thing as the abolition of the jury system. The war cannot be executed without his consent, it is authored by it cannot be carried out without the authorization of the population. One may object that although he has given consent over his own body, he is acting to kill another body over which he does not have the power of consent. Though this is certainly true, it is also true that the opponent facing him across the trenches, by his very presence on this ground, has himself consented. Further, the two ends of the weapon exist in a one-to-one relation. One soldier's body is put at risk while one opponent's body is put at risk. Of course, if he is a good soldier, he will injure more than one opponent. And thus the ratio will be 1 to 5, or 1 to 20, but there are good soldiers on the other side as well, and thus the fundamental framing ratio of agency to risk is sustained. At any given moment, one body of the opponent may be taken to substantiate the boy's beliefs and, conversely, he makes available to the opponent one body, his own. This one-to-one ratio beyond seeming merely fair has the critical function of ensuring that the free-floating beliefs cannot be wholly separate from awareness of the aversiveness of injuries, cannot become wholly unanchored from the knowledge of the cost of the beliefs to the believers. The ratio of persons at the two ends of the weapon, the ratio of authorization to risk, changes in nuclear war from something close to 1 to 1, depending on the war, 1 to 3, 1 to 20, to 1 to millions, a ratio that can be more precisely determined by counting the number of political and military persons involved in the decision and the number of people who are the act's casualties. Consent is in nuclear war a structural impossibility. At no point does the population exercise any will over their own participation, as may be seen by contemplating three separate temporal moments. First, the time prior to war. Second, the actual moment of the war's outbreak. Third, the succession of moments constituting the duration of the war. First, the time period prior to the war. It might be argued that the existence of a nuclear arsenal, paid for by the population's taxes, contains an implicit act of consent, that a contract for participation was forged and renewed on April 15th of each year, or an equivalent date in other countries. There are two bases on which this argument is wrong. First, taxes are paid to provide for an array of social programs and uses, and there is no provision within the tax procedure that allows the stipulation of money for the salaries of members of Congress and the building of schools on the one hand, and none for weapons on the other. Presumably, however, a tax form could be invented that gave the taxpayer this very power of stipulation. Even then, however, the problem would not be solved. Even were they to agree to finance nuclear weapons, this would not be a sanctioning of the war itself. The equivalent might be an election in which the population voted to forfeit permanently all subsequent elections, that is, they agreed not simply to alter, by means of a provision within the Constitution itself, but agreed to surrender any subsequent power of constitutional self-alteration. A more precise analog might be the invention of a voting machine that eliminated the need for the population to come to the polls and vote, because the power to guess the will of the people was built into the machine itself. If the invention and manufacture of the machine had been paid for by tax dollars, the civil line vote would still not be the population's vote. The existence of an arsenal of guns in the United States in 1858 does not mean that President Lincoln, without further consultation of the people, is thereby authorized one day in 1861 to retract all life support systems from beneath the feet of 500,000 persons, for the existence of weapons and the use of weapons require two separate acts of consent. That is, the existence of weapons and the use of weapons, the making up and the making real of the capacity to injure, are two radically different occurrences. To agree to the existence of weapons is to say, there could conceivably someday be a use for war, and not to say, the hypothetical existence of a use sanctions any use. Second, consider the moment of war's outbreak. Suppose it were possible to consult the world's population in the hours before the nuclear weapons were fired. Suppose also the unlikely outcome that the consulted world population voted yes. Would this make a difference? The certain and correct answer to this question is yes, it emphatically would make a difference. But it is crucial to see that not only is the yes vote improbable, the vote itself is impossible. That it is an absolute structural impossibility is not just an unfortunate and accidental attribute of nuclear arms, it is essential to what it is what it is. The missile is the building in of an unprecedented capacity to injure and the building out of consent, the shattering of the ratio of willed authorization to willed risk by a factor of millions. Third, if consent were given by the impossible world vote on the first day, this event would vastly improve the claim that nuclear weapons have a rightful place within civilization, but there would not even then be nearly the degree of consent that exists in conventional war. Estimates about the duration of nuclear war tend to range from hours to months. It is sometimes said that the number of casualties in the first day's exchange might be about 50 million, the AP proximate number of deaths that occurred in 5 years of fighting in World War II. How do the two differ? As observed above, the individual soldier in a conventional war does not give or withhold his participation in a single moment of decision. He must continually renew his presence over many successive days. His willingness may dissolve when he first sees the battlefield. Instead, he may, seeing the battlefield one day, still be willing until at the end of the second day. He finds a bullet hole in his backpack. Instead, he may be unfazed by the bullet hole in his pack the second day but become unwilling on the third day when he receives a non-lethal wound in his shoulder. Instead, he may be willing on that third day and only become unwilling on the fourth day when he receives a second, this time mortal, wound and dies. This same continually open modulation of authorization must be understood in terms of an entire population. Each side works to out-injure the other. That is, as clarified earlier, each side works to bring the other side to its perceived level of intolerable injury faster than it is itself brought to its own level of intolerable injury. Each side works to bring about in the opponent a perceptual reversal. Instead of body damage seeming acceptable and loss of territorial ideological attributes seeming unacceptable, it will come to perceive additional damage as unacceptable and loss of national attributes as acceptable. This means, importantly, that at the point where one side undergoes the reversal and designates itself loser, the other side stops injuring. That is, each side exercises control over how much it is injured and can on any day bring about the cessation of injuring by announcing itself the loser. A country may decide this after 3 days and 120 deaths, instead after 50 days and 90,000 injuries, instead after 300 days and 11 million injuries, instead after 5 years and 50 million deaths. It each day has the renewed option of saying, this is enough. Thus the 50 million deaths in one day's nuclear exchange and the 50 million in 5 years of World War II are incomparable. Even if the nuclear exchange had begun with the population's vote, itself an impossible proposition, it would even then only be the same as World War II if in World War II the disputing governments and populations had been given a chance to say yes or no on a single day in 1939, and were not again given the option of saying yes or no until one day in 1945. Instead, week by week over 300 weeks, day by day over almost 2,000 days, the collective populations renewed their consent to be more greatly injured, as in other wars Korea, Vietnam, Falkland Islands the national participants have consented to a however terrible, much smaller level of injury. Because in nuclear war the collective casualties occur almost simultaneously, the injured populations do not have the power to authorize the degree and level of injury. If in the moment the missile strikes a 4-mile radius of a given city, the words "we surrender" are spoken, they will not stop the blast of heat and fire from extending out over another 20 miles, and as the range of that blast reaches that 20-mile perimeter, the words "we surrender" will not stop the radiation in its outward movement over hundreds of miles more. Thus, just as the act of consent is built out of the initial firing of the missile, so it is eliminated from the massive interior of its self-amplifying action. If there should be a nuclear war, when it is looked back upon by populations of future centuries, the differences between it and previous conventional wars will probably appear much greater to them than it does to us now. They may look back upon our present situation the way we now look back upon the slaves building the pyramids of Egypt, as a population who have ceased to exercise political autonomy over their own most intimate property, the human body. Of course, the analogy is not accurate. 192 for the physical distress of forced work in substantiation of a cultural construct like the pyramids is not the absolute surrender of physical autonomy that occurs in bodies maimed and burned in substantiation of national constructs, nor is the elimination of embodied consent occurring in the same degree in the two, for the slave still authorizes the moved merits of his body as he each day wakes up, walks to the pyramid, puts his hand to the stone, and begins to lift and carry. Perhaps he believes the very beautiful artifact to which he contributes his embodied labor implicitly includes him in its civilizing embrace, that he is its partial author. Perhaps instead he perceives himself as excluded, but chooses, along with the rest of his generation, to devote his lifetime to this aimless project rather than to the shorter life's project of rebellion. Yet from a distance of many centuries, we often ask why they permitted it, for it is a universal fate of those from whom the power to author their own fate has been retracted that later populations reattribute to them the power of authorship and speak of them as permitting it. This question is not only asked, retrospectively, of the slaves 40 centuries ago, but of the concentration camp prisoners 4 decades ago. The same question, however unfair, will be asked of us. If there is to be an answer to those future populations, it will only be heard in the words spoken to contemporary military and political leaders, words that will have to be spoken very clearly and soon.